Two black cars came up the broken asphalt of Sycamore Hill and stopped at the end of a gravel drive on the edge of a dying Ohio town. The 63-year-old woman inside was certain they had come to take the last thing she had left. Then the man in the charcoal suit removed his sunglasses and said, "Mrs. Boyd, do you remember the winter of 1991? A boy who stole insulin in the cold." Frances Boyd went still. 35 years collapsed into nothing. She had once caught a frightened 17-year-old trying to walk out of her pharmacy with medicine for his dying mother, and she had not called the sheriff. She paid for it out of her own thin purse. She fed him, taught him, pressed her dead father's stethoscope into his hands, and drove him 90 miles toward a future he didn't believe he was allowed to want. Then he vanished into the world, the way the ones you rescue are supposed to. She didn't know he had spent 25 years searching for her. She didn't know he had become one of the most gifted surgeons in the country, with 9,000 lives behind his hands. And she didn't know that the people standing on her porch were holding an envelope with her name on it, and a letter he had left, to be opened by no one until after he was gone. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever wondered whether one small, quiet mercy can outlast a whole lifetime, whether the few seconds you spend a stranger in the cold ever really find their way home, stay with this one all the way to the end. Let's begin. The two black cars came up Sycamore Hill just after 8 in the morning, slow over the broken asphalt, and stopped at the end of Frances Boyd's gravel drive. The county road behind them was empty the way it always was on a Tuesday, just frost burning off the fence wire and a dog barking 3 properties down. Fran was standing at her kitchen window with a cup of instant coffee going cold in her hand, and when she saw the cars, she set the cup down very carefully on the sill, the way you set down something you might need both hands free to deal with. She had learned these last 4 months that nobody drove up Sycamore Hill to give her good news. She was 63 years old. Until the spring, she had been the bookkeeper at Renner's Pharmacy down on Front Street for 36 years. And now she was the woman the whole town of Stillwell, Ohio, believed had stolen $61,000 from a dying old man's business. The cars in her driveway were the kind of cars that meant lawyers, and Fran could not imagine a single lawyer in the state who would be coming to her door to help. 2 people got out, a man in a charcoal suit, maybe 40, and a younger woman carrying a leather folder against her chest like it was something she'd been told not to drop. They stood at the bottom of the drive and looked up at the little rented house with its sagging porch and its one good window. And the man said something to the woman, and the woman nodded. Then they started up the gravel. Fran opened the door before they could knock. She did not invite them in. She had stopped inviting people in around the 2nd week of May. "Mrs. Boyd?" the man said. "Frances Boyd, formerly Frances Hale?" She hadn't heard that name in years. Hale was her father's name and her own, the name she had carried through a brief first marriage and gone back to the year she buried Colleen's father, and worn all through the long stretch when she raised the girl alone. She'd only set it down at the turn of the century, when she married Gerald Boyd, and Gerald had been gone himself for 19 years now. Nobody had called her Hale in a very long time. Nobody alive still thought to. "It's Boyd now," she said. "Has been since 1999. What's this about? Because if it's about Renner's, you can talk to the public defender's office." "I'm not supposed to. It isn't about Renner's." The man took off his sunglasses. He had a careful, tired face, the face of someone who had practiced what he was about to say and still wasn't sure how it would land. "My name is Daniel Okafor. This is my associate, Priya Shah. We've been trying to locate you for almost a year, Mrs. Boyd. We came up from Columbus. May we come in? It's about a young man you knew a very long time ago." Fran stood in the doorway with the cold coming in around her ankles and felt the morning tilt very slightly under her feet. "I don't know any young men," she said. "I keep books. I don't know who you think I am." That was not entirely true anymore, of course. She used to keep books. For 4 months now, she had kept nothing but the inside of this house and her own counsel. The mornings were the worst of it. She would wake at the same 5:40 she'd woken at for 36 years, her body still believing it had somewhere to be. And then she would remember all at once the whole weight of it, that there was no register to count down, no Front Street to walk to, no version of herself the town still recognized. She had taken to ironing things that did not need ironing just to have a reason to stand up. She had $11 and some change in her checking account and a public defender named Ortega who returned about 1 call in 3 and a court date in November that she thought about the way you think about a tooth that has started to ache. Pride was the only furniture she had left, and she sat very straight in it. The winter of 1991, the lawyer said gently. A 17-year-old boy. He stole 2 vials of insulin and a box of syringes from the pharmacy where you worked. And you didn't call the police. 35 years folded shut like a hand. Stay with me here. The 2 people who just walked up her drive know something about Frances Boyd that even she has half forgotten, and before this is over, the whole town of Stillwell is going to learn it too. If stories like this one are why you're here, subscribe before we go inside. Let's begin. Fran's living room was small and clean and smelled of lemon oil and the dust that comes off old upholstery no matter how often you wipe it down. She had a recliner, a love seat with a quilt over the worn arm, and a wall of framed photographs that the lawyer and his associate both looked at without meaning to as they sat. A girl at a high school graduation, a man in a fishing hat, Gerald, gone 19 years now, an old man in a doctor's coat standing in front of a building that no longer existed. That's my father, Fran said, because they were looking. Harlan Hale. He was the doctor in this town for 41 years. The only one most of that time. She sat down across from them, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight the way her mother had taught her to sit when strangers came. Now, you'd better tell me what you've come to tell me, because I've had about all the surprises I can use this year. Daniel Okafor opened his briefcase. He did not rush. Fran would think later that he was a kind man, and that kindness in a lawyer was a rarer thing than people gave it credit for. Mrs. Boyd, I need to ask you to think back to the winter of 1991. February specifically, you would have been working the counter at Renner's Pharmacy. There was a cold snap that year, and one evening near closing, a teenage boy came in, Mr. Okafor. Fran's voice was level, but something underneath it had begun to move. I worked that counter for 36 years. A lot of boys came in. This one had a black eye that was almost healed. He was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. And he tried to walk out with insulin in his pocket because his mother was diabetic and they'd run out, and the welfare office wasn't going to reissue until the first of the month. The room went very quiet. Out on the county road, a truck downshifted and was gone. Fran did not say anything for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the 2 black cars in her drive, as though they might explain themselves. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The level business-like tone was gone, and what was underneath it was 35 years deep. His name was Theo, she said. Theo Hardigan. He was 17. His mother was Carolyn. She pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass. I never told a soul about that night. Not one person in 35 years. How do you know about it? Daniel Okafor reached into the briefcase and took out a photograph and laid it on the coffee table, turning it so she could see. It was a man in surgical scrubs, photographed in a hospital corridor, caught mid-stride and half lawing at something off camera. He was somewhere in his late 40s. His hair had gone gray at the temples and there were lines around his eyes, but the eyes themselves were the same, and Fran knew them at once. She had last seen those eyes across a pharmacy counter, wide and terrified and 17 years old, while she decided in the space of about 4 seconds whether to ruin a boy's life or not. Oh, she said, the word came out very small. Oh, look at him, Dr. Theodore Hardigan, the lawyer said quietly. He went by Theo. He became one of the most respected cardiothoracic and trauma surgeons in the Midwest. He ran the surgical trauma program at a teaching hospital in Cincinnati for 16 years. He is estimated to have personally operated on more than 9,000 patients over the course of his career. Fran sat back down because her knees told her to. He made it, she said. He actually made it. And then, because she was a mother and could not help it, the next question came out before she could stop it. Why isn't he here? If you've been looking for me, why didn't he just come himself? Daniel Okafor and Priya Shah exchanged a look, and Fran understood. She had buried enough people to know what that look meant. She had seen it on a doctor's face in 2007 when they came to tell her about her own father. He passed away 7 months ago, Mrs. Boyd, the lawyer said. A hereditary cardiac condition. The same one, as it turns out, that he'd spent his whole life operating on in other people. He knew about it for years. He kept working anyway. He paused. He was 52. Fran put her hand over her mouth. The boy with the black eye and the stolen insulin. The boy she had fed and lectured and driven 90 miles in a borrowed car. Gone, 7 months in the ground, before she ever got to see what he became. If a story like this one is already getting to you, take a second to subscribe before you go any further. This channel exists for people who still believe that what you give quietly, in the dark, when nobody is watching, and nobody could ever pay you back, finds its way home eventually. It always does. Now let's keep going, because the part nobody knew is still coming. I need to tell you about that winter, Fran said. About why I did what I did. You should know who he was when he walked in, because the man in that photograph didn't come from nowhere. Somebody had to decide he was worth the trouble first. She looked at the lawyer. Take your time hearing it. I've got nothing but time these days. The whole town's made sure of that. So she told them, and the telling took her back 35 years. Stillwell sat in a fold of the Appalachian foothills in southeastern Ohio, a town of just under 3,000 people, built on coal that had run out, and clay that had run out after it, hanging on by the thread of a state highway, and the stubbornness of the people who couldn't think of anywhere better to be. Front Street was 4 blocks long. There had been a hardware store, a five and dime, a movie house, and Renner's Pharmacy. And by 1991, the pharmacy was the only one of the 4 still keeping its lights on. Fran had grown up in that town as the doctor's daughter, which had given her a strange double life. On the one hand, everybody knew her. On the other, everybody owed her father something, a stitched-up hand, a delivered baby, a bill he'd quietly torn up, and people don't always love the family of the man they owe. Harlan Hale had been the kind of country doctors who drove out to coal camps at 2 in the morning and accepted a sack of green beans as payment and never once mentioned the difference. He had raised Fran on a single principle, repeated so often it had worn a groove in her. You don't get to choose who deserves help. You only get to choose whether you're the kind of person who gives it. She had married young, had her daughter Colleen, and lost her husband to a logging accident before the girl started kindergarten. By 1991, she was 28 years old, raising Colleen alone in the apartment above the closed-down Five and Dime, keeping the books at Renner's 6 days a week, and working the counter on the evenings. When old Mr. Renner's hands got too bad to count change. Most days she was fine. Some days she stood at that counter at closing and wondered what the whole long arithmetic of her life was supposed to add up to. That February the cold came down out of the hills and stayed. The creek behind the cannery froze solid enough that the Pruitt boys skated on it. The salt trucks ran out of salt by the 8th of the month, and the county quit answering the phone about it. At night, Fran would walk Colleen the half-block home from the pharmacy, with the girl's mittened hand in hers, and the snow squeaking under their boots like styrofoam, and the windows of Front Street would be dark on both sides except for the one yellow square of Renner's behind them, and Fran would think that this was what a dying town looked like from the inside. Not a catastrophe, just a slow subtraction, one dark window at a time. The diner had closed in October. The Methodist Church had gone to one service a month. People left and didn't come back, and the ones who stayed got quieter, and the cold made everybody quieter still. She was 28 and a widow and the strange daughter of a dead doctor, and on the worst nights, she felt the town subtracting her too. That was the winter Theo Hartigan walked in. It was a Thursday, in February, brutally cold, the kind of cold that made the front door's hinges scream and put a skin of ice on the inside of the display window. Fran was alone, counting down the register, about to flip the sign, when the door shrieked open and a boy came in on a gust of frozen air. She knew who he was. Everybody knew the Hartigans. Carolyn Hartigan had been a pretty woman once, before the diabetes and the bad marriage and the worst divorce, and now she was sick in a way the town talked about in low voices. The boy, Theo, was a senior at the high school who was rumored to be about to drop out, and he had a fresh healing black eye that nobody in town had asked a single question about. He walked the aisles too fast. He didn't look at her, and Fran, who had spent her whole life around a man who read bodies for a living, watched the way the boy's hand drifted past the refrigerated case and came back to his coat pocket, and she knew exactly what was happening before it finished happening. She could have hit the silent button under the counter. Mr. Renner had it installed after the second break-in. She could have said the word, and a sheriff's deputy would have been there in 4 minutes, and Theo Hartigan would have gone into the county juvenile system with a theft charge attached to his name, and that would very likely have been the end of whatever he was ever going to become. Instead, she said, "It's colder than it has any right to be tonight." The boy froze in the aisle. He didn't turn around. My daddy used to say a February like this one was the Lord deciding who really wanted to make it to spring. Fran kept counting the register, not looking at him, giving him the only thing she had to give, which was the chance to put it back without being watched. There's a space heater behind the counter if you need to thaw out a minute. No charge for that. Stay with me here, because what the boy did next is the hinge the whole rest of this story turns on. If you're the kind of person who'd have looked the other way too, this channel was made for you. Go ahead and subscribe, and let's see what Theo Hartigan decided to do. Theo turned around. His face was the color of the frost on the window, and his eyes were doing the thing Fran would never forget, the thing that came back to her 35 years later in her own living room, wide and cornered and ashamed in a way no 17-year-old should have to be. His hand was still in his coat pocket. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then he took the 2 vials of insulin and the box of syringes out of his pocket and set them on the nearest shelf, very gently, the way you'd put down something you knew you didn't deserve to be holding. And he said, in a voice that cracked right down the middle of it, "I don't have the money. My mom needs it, and I don't have the money, and they won't give us more till the 1st. "I know," Fran said. "You're going to call the sheriff." "I'm not." She closed the register drawer. "But I'm not going to let you walk out of here and stick a needle in your mother with insulin you stole out of a cold case in the dark, either. Because if you get the dose wrong with the wrong vial, you'll kill her instead of help her. And then where will the 2 of you be?" She came around the counter. "Bring those here. Let me look at what you grabbed." She would tell the lawyers 35 years later that she did not entirely understand what she was doing in that moment. She only knew that the boy in front of her had the exact look her own father had spent 41 years answering. And that her father was 3 years dead by then, and that if Harlan Hale's daughter let a sick woman's son get hauled off for trying to keep his mother alive, then she didn't know what the point of having been raised by the man had even been. She checked the vials. He'd grabbed the right long-acting kind by luck. She rang it up herself, and the syringes, and a glucose meter besides, because the one he described his mother using sounded 10 years out of date, and the total came to $22.40, and she paid it out of her own purse and put the receipt in the register so the count would balance. And Mr. Renner would never know the difference. Then she made the boy sit on the stool behind the counter, and she taught him, carefully, the way her father had taught her, how to read the units on the syringe and how to rotate an injection site, and what the early signs of a low blood sugar looked like, so he could catch it before it caught his mother. He listened like his life depended on it. As it happened, his mother's did. "Why are you doing this?" he asked her when she'd written the dosing out on a card for him in block letters. "You don't even know me." "I knew your grandmother," Fran said. "She used to bring my daddy Peach preserves every August. And I know what it is to be the one holding everything up when you're too young to be holding it." She handed him the card, and because somebody should. That's the whole reason. Don't make it more complicated than it is. Somebody should. That was the whole of it. If you believe a sentence that simple can change the course of a person's life, you already understand what this channel is about. Subscribe, and let's find out what Theo did with it. He came back the next evening to pay her back the $22.40. He had it in quarters and crumpled ones. Money she suspected he'd earned doing something he wasn't going to tell her about, and she refused to take it. "Then let me work it off," he said. "I'll sweep, I'll stock, I'll do whatever. I don't take charity." It was the same stubbornness she'd grown up with, the same pride that had made the Kohlkamp families pay her father in green beans rather than owe him, and Fran respected it too much to argue with. So she put him to work. He swept the floors and broke down boxes and restocked the shelves. And Mr. Renner, who liked the boy's quiet and his strong back, started paying him a little under the table, and somewhere in there Theo Hartigan stopped being a boy who was about to drop out of high school. It was the medicine that did it. Fran watched it happen over that winter and into the spring. She found out where they lived because the receipt had needed an address. The Hartigans were 3 miles out the Ridge Road in a rented half of a double-wide that backed onto an old strip mine. And one Sunday in March, when Theo was working at the pharmacy, Fran drove out with a sack of groceries she told herself was nothing, just a few things that would have gone bad on her shelf anyway. Carolyn Hartigan answered the door in 2 sweaters and a man's wool socks because the propane had run low. She was 41 and looked 60. Her ankles were swollen and her vision had started to go in one eye. The diabetes taking her the slow, cruel way it took the poor who couldn't manage it right. And the trailer smelled of kerosene and the particular sweetness that comes off body the disease is winning against. But she had her son's eyes and she had her son's pride. And she did not want the groceries until Fran said, plainly, that it was for Theo's sake and not hers, that the boy couldn't study on an empty stomach, and she'd be doing Fran a kindness by feeding him. Carolyn took the sack then. At the door, holding it against her 2 sweaters, she said the only thing she ever said to Fran about any of it. "He talks about you. He didn't used to talk." Then she shut the door against the cold, and Fran drove home understanding exactly what she had walked into the middle of, and exactly why she was not going to walk back out of it. The boy was fascinated by the medicine. He'd read the inserts that came folded in the prescription boxes, the tiny print nobody read, and he'd ask her what the words meant. And when she didn't, he'd know. He'd ask the pharmacist, and when the pharmacist got tired of him, he started going to the little Carnegie Library 2 streets over and reading whatever they had. He kept his mother alive through that winter, on careful injections and a discipline that astonished the visiting nurse. He started going back to school. His grades, which had been the grades of a boy with nothing to lose, became the grades of a boy who had found something to win. One evening in the spring, after closing, Fran found him sitting on the stockroom floor with a beat-up library copy of a human anatomy textbook open on his knees, tracing the chambers of the heart with one finger, and she stood in the doorway and watched him for a while before he noticed her. "You want to be a doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. Theo closed the book like she'd caught him at something. "People like me don't get to be doctors. People like you." Fran came in and sat down on an overturned milk crate across from him. "You mean poor, I mean poor, and no daddy, and a mom who's sick, and a name that everybody in this town already wrote off." He wouldn't look at her. "I mean realistic." And here is where the story turns, and where what Fran said next went on to save lives she would never hear about, in cities she would never visit. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel only exists because people share it. Subscribe, and let me tell you exactly what a pharmacy bookkeeper in a dying coal town said to a 17-year-old boy on a stockroom floor. Fran was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father, 3 years gone, and the 41 years he'd spent being the only doctor a poor place had, and the green beans and the babies delivered in coal camps by lantern light. "Let me tell you about my father," she said. "Harlan Hale. He grew up about 9 miles from where you're sitting, in a house with a dirt floor, the 7th of 8 kids, and his own father couldn't read. There was no money. There was less than no money. By every realistic measure in the world, that boy was going to dig coal until the coal or his lungs gave out, whichever came first." She leaned forward. "He became a doctor anyway. 41 years. He delivered half this town. He sat with people while they died so they wouldn't have to do it alone. And do you know what he told me? The one time I asked him how a dirt floor kid with an illiterate father became a doctor." Theo finally looked up. "What?" He said, "Francis, the world is full of people who'll tell you what's realistic. Realistic is just the word people use for the size of their own imagination. Don't ever let somebody else's small imagination decide the size of your life." She held his eyes. "You kept your mother alive all winter with a syringe and a note card. You taught yourself to read prescription inserts at 17. Don't you dare tell me what's realistic. You don't know yet. None of us do. That's the whole point of being your age." Theo Hartigan didn't say anything for a long time. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand, fast, like he was hoping she hadn't seen, and he asked her if he could borrow the anatomy book a little longer, because the library wanted it back. The next week, Fran went up into the attic of the apartment, above the 5 and dime, and she opened the cedar trunk where she kept her father's things, and she took out the stethoscope. It was an old one, a Ticos from 1962, the year her father had finally been able to afford a good one after 11 years of practice. The tubing had gone a little stiff, and the metal was dull, but it still worked, and Harlan Hale had carried it for the last 45 years of his life around his neck in his office and folded in his black bag on the night drives. It was the single object Fran owned that most contained her father. She held it for a long while in the dusty attic light. Then she brought it down, and the next evening at the pharmacy she put it in Theo Hartigan's hands. "I can't take this," he said immediately. "This was your dad's. You can't just—" "It's not doing him any good in a trunk," Fran said. "And it's not doing me any good either. The only thing a stethoscope is good for is being around the neck somebody who's trying to hear what's wrong with a person so they can fix it. That's all it's for. My father would rather it was around your neck doing its job than in my attic being a memory." She closed his fingers over it. "You give it back me the day you graduate medical school. That's the deal. Not a day before, you hear me? You owe me a graduation." That summer she drove him 90 miles in old Mr. Renner's borrowed Buick to take a state scholarship examination he'd never have been able to get to otherwise, and she sat in a hot hallway for 4 hours while he took it, and on the way home he was so quiet she thought he'd failed, until he said, near the county line, "I think I knew some of it. I think I actually knew some of it," in a voice full of a kind of wonder, and Fran had to keep her eyes very hard on the road. She remembered every mile of that drive for the rest of her life. The Buick had no air conditioning and a radio that only caught one gospel station out of Marietta, and they'd driven up through the heat with the windows down and the green hills sliding by, and Theo had spent the whole way there with the borrowed review book open on his knees, mouthing the periodic table to himself like a prayer. She had packed sandwiches, because she knew there'd be no money for lunch, and she knew he'd never have said so. At the testing center, watching the other kids file in, kids from real high schools, kids in clothes that fit, kids whose parents waited in cars with the engines running and the air conditioning on. She had felt a flare of something close to fury on his behalf, and then she had watched him square his thin shoulders and walk in among them like he had every right to be there, and she had thought, there it is. Whatever it was she'd seen across the counter the night of the insulin, there it was again. He didn't believe he belonged. He went in anyway. That was the whole of courage, as far as Fran had ever been able to tell. Not the absence of the small imagination's voice, just walking in past it. He got the scholarship. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, but it was a door, and a door was all a kid like Theo had ever needed. He worked 3 jobs through community college, and then through the state university, and Fran wrote him a letter every couple of months, and he wrote back when he had time, which got rarer as the years went on, the way it does. He'd come back to Stillwell on holidays for a while, then less. Then his mother passed in 1998 and there was nothing to come back to, and the letters thinned to a Christmas card. And then even those stopped, and Fran told herself that was exactly how it was supposed to go. She kept his letters in a shoebox, the few she had. There was one she reread more than the others, written in his second year of medical school, in handwriting already starting to slant toward the prescription scrawl it would become. He'd written that he'd finally dissected a human heart that week. An old man's heart, donated, and that he'd held it in 2 hands and thought about her father's stethoscope hanging in his apartment, and that for the first time in his life he hadn't felt like a fraud who was about to be found out. "I keep waiting for somebody to come tell me I don't belong here," he'd written. "They keep not coming. I think it might have been you that ruined that for me, Mrs. Boyd. I can't seem to hear the realistic anymore. You broke the part of me that listened to it." Fran had laughed out loud reading it, alone in her kitchen, and then she had cried, and then she had put it back in the shoebox. And over the years that followed, she took it out whenever the town, or the loneliness, or her own small imagination got to telling her that her life had added up to nothing much. You don't help a young person so they'll stay tied to you. You help them so they can leave. The leaving is the whole point. She'd have been ashamed of any other reason. She figured she'd never know what became of him. She figured wrong. He carried that stethoscope into every operating room for more than 30 years. If that doesn't move you, I don't know what will. There's more, and it's bigger than the stethoscope. Subscribe so this story can find the next person who needs it, and let's go back to that living room. Daniel Okafor had been listening without interrupting, and when Fran finished, her hands were trembling slightly in her lap, and Priya Shah had quietly set a box of tissues on the coffee table without making a thing of it. "He did give it back to you," the lawyer said. "He tried to. He came back to Stillwell the summer he graduated medical school in 2001 with that stethoscope in his bag to find you and make good on the deal. But by then you'd remarried, taken the name Boyd, and moved up here to Sycamore Hill, and the pharmacy had changed hands twice, and the people he asked either didn't remember a bookkeeper named Fran Hale or had the name wrong. He paused. He looked for you on and off for 25 years. He never had your married name. He was looking for a Hale. There is no Hale left in Stillwell to find." Fran pressed the tissue to her eyes and said nothing. "He kept the stethoscope," Okafor went on. "He wore it through his entire career. Every nurse and resident who trained under him knew about it. They thought it was a good luck thing, an old surgeon's superstition. He never told them the whole story. He only ever told them it had belonged to a country doctor, and that it had come to him from the only person who ever told him his life could be big." The lawyer reached into the briefcase again. He told the full story exactly once, in a letter. which he left with very specific instructions that it not be opened by anyone and not be delivered until we had found you and could put it in your hands ourselves. He set an envelope on the coffee table. Across the front in a doctor's slanting hand it said, "For Frances, the woman who didn't call the sheriff. When you find her, and not before." Fran looked at it the way you look at something that might go off. "Before you read it," Okafor said, "there are two more things I'm required to explain, because his will was very precise about the order." "May I?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He laid a folder beside the envelope. Dr. Hartigan never married and had no children of his own. He left the bulk of his estate to establish a charitable foundation. He wrote the foundation's mission himself years ago and named it before he ever knew whether we'd find you alive. Okafor turned the folder so she could read the cover. "It's called the Harlan Hale Fund, after your father. For students from Appalachian counties, kids who, in his words, the world has already decided aren't realistic candidates, to go to medical and nursing school. He'd funded 11 of them quietly while he was alive. The endowment he left will fund roughly 9 a year in perpetuity." Fran read the name on the folder. Harlan Hale Fund. Her father's name on something that would outlive every person currently breathing in the town that had once paid him in green beans. "He named it after my father," she said. "He never even met my father. He met him every day for more than 30 years, the lawyer said quietly, around his own neck. This is the part where most people have to stop the video for a second. And that's all right. When you come back, there's one more thing the lawyer hasn't said yet, and it changes everything about why he's standing in her living room today, of all days, this month of all months. Subscribe, take a breath, and let's keep going." "That's the foundation," Okafor said. "Now I need to explain the second thing, and I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Boyd, it's the reason we pushed so hard to find you this particular year." He folded his hands. "When we finally traced you, through your father's old medical license records, of all things, which is how we connected Boyd back to Hale, we learned that you're currently facing criminal charges. Embezzlement from Renner's Pharmacy. $61,000. The warmth that had been gathering in Francesca turned over and went cold. "That's right," she said, and her voice was flat again, the voice she'd developed over 4 months of being the most hated woman in Stillwell. "And I didn't do it, for whatever that's worth, which around here is nothing. Renner's sold to a chain 4 years ago. They brought in a regional manager named Brett Saylor. The books stopped balancing about 2 years back, insurance reimbursements coming up short, and when the corporate auditors came down looking for who'd been skimming, they found a 63-year-old bookkeeper who'd had access to everything for 36 years and made easy buys." She lifted her chin. "Easier than looking at the man they'd just promoted. I lost my job in April. I'm out on bond. My daughter won't return my calls because her husband works for the same company and doesn't want the association. And the whole town has decided that the doctor's strange daughter was a thief all along." She looked at the lawyer. "So you'll forgive me if a foundation named after my father, however kind, doesn't fix very much about my Tuesday." Daniel Okafor was quiet for a moment, and then he did something Fran did not expect. He smiled, just slightly, the smile of a man who has been waiting a long time to deliver a particular piece of news. "Mrs. Boyd," he said, "do you know what a forensic accountant is? If you're already rooting for Fran Boyd, do her one favor and subscribe, because the back half of this story is about what happens when somebody's quiet kindness comes back around with a team of lawyers attached. Let's keep going." "I know what an accountant is," Fran said warily. "I've been one for 36 years. A forensic accountant," Okafor said, "is what you hire when you want to take a set of crooked books apart thread by thread and prove who actually pulled the threads. They're expensive. They're very expensive. They're so expensive that a 63-year-old woman out on bond from a public defender's office could never in 1,000 years afford one. Which is exactly why the corporation that owns Renner's was so comfortable telling the easy story about you." He leaned forward. "The Hartigan estate retains 3 of the best forensic accountants in the state, and the foundation's charter, which Dr. Hartigan wrote himself, includes a clause for the legal defense of, and I'm quoting him now, people in his home region who are being crushed by an institution that has more money than they do and is using it to avoid the truth." Okafor's smile widened just slightly. "He didn't write that clause for you specifically. He couldn't have known wrote it because it was the kind of thing that had nearly happened to him and to his mother, his whole young life. But it fits you, Mrs. Boyd. It fits you like it was tailored." Fran sat very still. When you're ready, the lawyer said, and only if you want it, the foundation would like to put its forensic team on the Renner's books. At no cost to you, to find out what actually happened to that $61,000. He let that settle. I read the affidavit, Mrs. Boyd. I've seen a lot of these. The story they're telling about you has holes in it you could drive, Mr. Renner's old Buick through. For 4 months, Fran Boyd had not cried where anyone could see her. She had held her chin up at the arraignment, and at the grocery store, and on the rare Tarot Sunday, she made herself go to church, where people she'd known her whole life found somewhere else to look. She had not given the town the satisfaction. But she put her face in her hands now, in her own living room, in front of 2 strangers from Columbus, and she wept because somewhere a 52-year-old surgeon she had known for one winter, when he was 17, had reached out of the grave to put a